All right, so in this video, I want to take you through the three primary stacks that you will use to organize your various view components on the screen. That's the VStack, the HStack, and the ZStack. And what I want to do is start off kind of where we left off a little bit in some of the previous getting started videos with SwiftUI. And just as a reminder, even though you may not have covered structs yet, don't worry about that. This basic structure right here of code is where you're going to start from to get something on the screen. And this part right here where it's declaring a variable, you've probably covered variables at least. So here's var, and then the name of this variable is body. It turns out it returns a view. It gives you back a value of a view, and that is all defined in those parentheses right there. So in this case, remember we have this text view that has a string as an argument, and then it is given a modifier, which is some padding, and that's what we see over here. And when I have this selected, obviously I have this blue line showing here, and I have hello world. So what we're going to do is let's take this out and do something a little more interesting. And what we're going to start with is basically a rectangle. And so it turns out that there is a built-in rectangle already there for us as a view. And so we can just essentially type rectangle with open and close paren. We'll not give it any parameters, and I don't believe it takes any. And we could find out by just doing this with open paren, and sure enough, it's showing nothing here. And so what we want to do is define this rectangle, and then let's talk about the sizing a little bit first. So it took up this whole area, and the reason it did is because it's one of these components or views that wants to take up as much size as is given to it by the parent. So the parent view said, well, I have no constraints at this point, so you can take the whole screen, and the rectangle saying, great, thank you so much, I will. Now, we could limit that a little bit. We could say with a modifier, we can say frame, which is frame is the sort of the border around what this is going to fit in. And I can say open paren, and I can see a bunch of different parameters here. Now, if I click on this, I'm going to be given all of them, and I'm going to have to fill in each one of those. And also it's showing what the defaults are. But I'm not going to do that. What I want to do is I just want to say max height of 50. And when I do that, I get a rectangle now that is only 50 pixels high. And of course, we might say, ooh, I don't like the fact that it's sort of stuck on the sides here. And so again, that's the padding modifier. So we could type in .padding, and you just hit enter to accept that. And we don't give it any parameters, so we're not telling it how much padding to use. It turns out the default is 20. And so what it's doing is it's putting 20 pixels of padding around this rectangle. Now let's suppose I wanted a second rectangle on top of that. Well, to do that, what I might think I could do is just say, well, I'll just copy this and create a second rectangle. But that actually doesn't work. And the reason it doesn't work is because this variable called body wants to return a view. Each one of these is a view. And now, therefore, it's getting back two views, and that is just not going to fly. And in our canvas, it actually turns out it's trying to preview them as two different applications, if you will. And that's not what we want. So what we want to do is put these in what's called a stack of some type. It could be a vertical stack, a horizontal stack, or a ZStack. And I want you to think about these stacks as a way of almost like a folder with files in it. So this rectangle is like a file. And if I want to have two files, I need to at least put those in a folder. So we're going to do this rectangle and say we're going to put you in a VStack. So I command click on rectangle, and I get a bunch of choices here. This one I'm interested in is embed in the VStack. So you notice that you have HStack, VStack, and ZStack, and those are given to us automatically because they're so commonly used, which is why I want to start with these. You can use this to embed a whole lot of different types of things inside each other, in which case you're going to come down here and just use the embed ... and then fill in what you want. But in our case, we'll do VStack. So we hit VStack, And now we've actually put the rectangle in a VStack. However, we don't see any change over here, and that's because the VStack itself is an organizational entity that will organize things within it, but it in and of itself is not showing any UI of any type. So what we can do is now copy this rectangle. So I'm going to copy, paste, and now look what happens. I get two rectangles stacked on top of each other. And I could continue to do this. So I could go up here and I could take all of these and put them like that. And now I have 4. So this gives you an idea of how these various components could be put together and be stacked vertically. For example, I could take this rectangle out, and what if I wanted to put one of our text components here? So I could do that, and there's my text component, and here are the rectangles, and here it is, all vertically stacked. So what I'm going to do is take this out, and let's look at the next scenario, which is the horizontal stack. Now, as you can imagine, this is going to stack things horizontally, so you might guess what this might do. So if I come over here and I take the V out and I put an H in, I now have horizontally stacked these rectangles. Now, again, rectangles want to take up as much space as they possibly can, and we've limited the height of these rectangles to 50. Therefore, they're not going up very high. And the reason that they're not any wider is because this is as wide as they could get and still fit in the space of the iPhone. So if we were to rotate this to landscape, we would see them stretch out. So to see this easily, we can actually run it in the simulator. And the way we run things in the simulator is Command R. And so what we're going to do is build and run. And so we'll get the simulator up and running here in a second. So here's the simulator up and running. And if I just do Command right arrow, I've rotated it to landscape. And notice now how it's basically made these wider because it wants to take up all the space it can get. The iPhone has told it, hey, you have a lot more width, and so these have now gone wider. So here we are. We've got the horizontal stack, and notice if I were to take these frame heights out, what would happen? Now, remember, if you're doing things here and you're not seeing any changes over here, that's probably because this needs to be resumed. So go ahead and hit resume, and that will get it back in sync, and sure enough, we're in sync, and now we can see the nature of the fact that the rectangle wants to take up as much height as it can get and as much width as it can get. All right, so that's HStacks. Now, the ZStack is yet another item. So let's say we want to take a rectangle, and let's give it a color of blue. So we'll say dot foreground blue, because I'm tired of that black. And now within this rectangle, I want to put a yellow circle right in the middle. So how do we do that? Well, HStacks are going to put things left to right, and VStacks are top to bottom. So the third dimension, if you will, is going in back or in front of the surface of the phone, so to speak. So essentially what we want to do is use what's called a ZStack. But just to illustrate this, let's suppose I put a circle here. So in my HStack, I have a circle. And notice I can't spell circle. All right, so we fixed that. We have circle. And it gave us some, again, a circle is like a rectangle. It wants to take up as much space as it can. So in this case, it's taking up half of what it can take up, and the rectangle's taking up the other half. And of course, our circle goes right here to the edge. Why? Because it has no padding. So we could go down here and we could type padding, and sure enough, we end up with padding around our circle. Now, we could now say, well, I want to limit the size of my circle to be a certain dimension so that it doesn't take up the whole space when it goes on top of my rectangle. And so what we could do here is, again, say dot frame, and I could say max width of, why don't we say 100, and now it is 100 wide, and notice it's only taking up that amount of space and everything else is given to that rectangle. All right, so now what we want to do is actually have these in a ZStack rather than an HStack. Again, we just come up here and we can say Z for ZStack, and now we have put the circle and the rectangle in a ZStack. Now the ZStack, you'll say, well, where did the circle go? Well, the reason the circle isn't showing is because it's behind the rectangle. So anything that's listed first is going to be farther back, and then as we keep listing items, they're coming farther to the front, farther to the front, farther to the front. So if I want the circle to be in front of the rectangle, I just have to change this order. So now when I do that, I change the order. I now have a circle in front of the rectangle. And that is basically how we do a ZStack. So the next thing I want to do is cover how you can kind of combine and put these things together. So let's say, for example, I wanted to have a circle to the left and then two horizontal blue rectangles to the right of it. So how would we do that? Well, first off, let's go ahead and take all this out. And we're going to start with that rectangle again. And we'll make sure that it is dot foreground color dot blue. And we're going to make sure that its frame height is set to 50. So what we want to do is we want to have these stacked, and then we want a circle to the left of both of them. So what we can do is, well, we know we want those stacked, so we can start with that. So we can click on this and say embed in a VStack. And then I can come over here and take the rectangle again, copy and paste it. And now I have two rectangles stacked on top of each other. So now I want to get a circle over here on the left-hand side. So what I could do is say, well, the circle in relation to these two things is a horizontal stack. So I can come up here and I can click on VStack and say I'm going to embed you in an HStack. And of course, the HStack doesn't show anything yet because there's only this one component horizontally, which is taking up the whole space. So we could come up here and say circle. And now we have a circle, which is taking up the left side. And we have the two rectangles that are blue on the right side. So let's give this a different foreground color. How about red? And let's limit its width. So that's with a frame. And voila, we've actually created now a red circle and two blue rectangles, and they are, this is a horizontal stack, and this is a vertical stack. And the only other thing I want to mention here is, again, you could see this padding here. So we could do some different types of paddings. We don't have to affect the other padding piece. So for example, on the circle, I could just say dot padding, and there's something called leading and trailing. So left is leading, right is trailing. And the reason they don't use left or right is because in language, if we were doing this with text fields and so forth, leading and trailing can be different depending on the language. Some languages you read from right to left and not left to right. But in our scenario, just think about it from an English perspective, is dot leading. So I could say dot leading 20, and notice now it added 20 pixels over here on the left side, but it didn't adjust anything else from that perspective. The other thing you would notice is these rectangles don't have any padding, but yet I still see some spacing between this. And that's because the VStack can have some spacing associated with every of the elements as a default. And you can find out this by basically, if you go over here to the VStack and I do an open paren to complete it, we can actually see it has parameters that can be passed to it. One of them is alignment, one of them is spacing, and one of them is content. In our case, the spacing is defaulting. We haven't given it a spacing, so I think it's defaulting to probably 5 pixels. So if I were to come in here and I were to say spacing 0, we notice now that the spacing has gone away and we have one rectangle stacked right on top of another with no space in between. So this is VStack, HStack, and ZStack. And those will be fundamental things that you're going to use throughout all of your projects in getting things to align and put things together.